Let's talk about trauma, about pain, chronic pain, and the body as an electrical being, as a charge, a current of electrical input. Now, when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about the body's inability to bounce back from an experience. That can be a physical trauma, that can be an emotional trauma, a psychological trauma, but all of these things have a similarity in that our body and our systems are overwhelmed. They become stuck in this traumatic experience. They are not able to bounce back readily. And this can become a pattern that becomes stuck in the body. There are three main ways that we experience pain in the body. We have the sensory pathway of pain. So if I cut my finger, it alerts the nerves in that area to send an impulse into the spinal cord, into the nervous system, into those afferent nerves that go up into the thalamus and the emotional centers of the brain. That is our sensory pathway that goes from the site of trauma into the brain. We also have a cognitive experience of pain. So if we are bumping our heads on a beam that's too low in an area that we frequent, that cognitive part that takes place in our prefrontal cortex tells us, okay, that beam is there. Whenever I am coming through this area, I need to duck. There's a cognitive experience of that pain that teaches us to avoid that pain in the future. There is a third reaction to pain or trauma, and that's an emotional response. And that emotional response takes place in the limbic center of the brain, in the limbic cortex, in the insula. It takes place in the amygdalas that deal with pleasure or fear. And these areas can become hyperreactive in a relationship with that cognitive function of pain, where our brain becomes hyperreactive and sets up these pathways between that prefrontal cortex and those limbic centers in the brain, those emotional centers in the brain. And instead of pain working up from the site of pain into the brain, into the cognitive centers, into the emotional centers, we have it working backwards. And this looks like when we are in sympathetic overdrive. So when we're talking about the nervous system, we have these branches of the nervous system. We have the central nervous system, we have the somatic nervous system, and then we have the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is in charge of our breath, our heart rate, our automatic functions that we don't think about doing, but we wouldn't be alive without them, right? Our breath is one of them. And this autonomic nervous system is divided into two branches, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is that fight, flight, danger, alert, reactive part of the nervous system. And the parasympathetic is that rest, digest, you're safe, you are at peace, you are where you belong at. And those two centers can have a area of stuckness. We can get stuck in a sympathetic fight or flight mode when we're constantly being driven, especially in the modern world, when we're under deadlines at work, stressful relationships, constantly inundated with areas of stress, whether that's our lighting, our food that we're eating, the toxins in our air and our food. All of these things act as stressors and can really lead us into a sympathetic overdrive. Now, when we experience trauma as children, we can flux and stay in that sympathetic dominant state. And we can stay there for a lifetime if it's not addressed. And when we're talking about how the body perceives pain, there is this backwards experience of pain where we're in a sympathetic overdrive. We are worried about the pain. That signals to the emotional centers of the brain that there is an issue, that there is pain, and that leads to an experience experience, a sensory experience of that pain. And when we're talking about pain, we can really look at it as not only a trauma, but a loss of charge in that area, a loss specifically of negative charge. No matter when we have experienced that trauma, whether it was in childhood, whether it's recently, working with that electrical charge in ways like grounding, mitochondrial function, circadian rhythm, nervous system resets, all of these things help recharge that negative capacity of the body, that negative electrical charge that our cells run on, especially our nervous system. And when we look at these experiences of trauma or these experiences of chronic pain and chronic fatigue syndrome, traumatic experiences, PTSD, and how they flux the body into a more hyperreactive state, we can achieve and work towards balance and homeostasis in the immune system, in the gut, in the nervous system, if we are addressing this net negative charge that the body thrives on. And so it's not just this chemical pathway. I mean, that's one of the reasons why opioids don't work so well, because they just work on that sensory experience of pain. But many people are experiencing pain in the emotional centers of the brain and the cognitive centers of the brain. So when we're talking about how to regain balance, about how to heal, we're talking about looking at the body from a quantum biological perspective, looking at the charge, looking at how to restore that negative charge. We're looking at the water that has that negative charge, contributes to that negative charge, the fascia, if there's any scarring from physical trauma or holding patterns, interference patterns from psychological or emotional trauma. Those act as obstacles to the flow of this electrical current in the body. I love talking about this information. Stay tuned for more.